When a waiter starts acting like he owns the place instead of just serving food, trouble is bound to follow. But what happens when his arrogance gets caught on camera and spirals into disaster? One wrong move, and his so-called fortress turns into a battlefield. Now imagine the stakes when a senator steps into the picture. Let's start from the beginning. In the heart of Manhattan, the Brass Fork stood tall as the go-to spot for New York's elite. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and waitstaff dressed sharper than most lawyers. It was all designed to scream exclusivity. This wasn't the kind of place you just wandered into. You had to belong. And if anyone took that rule to heart, it was Jack Miller, a 29-year-old waiter who acted like he owned the place. Jack had been at the Fork for years, and he saw himself as the gatekeeper. He had a sixth sense, or so he believed, for spotting people who didn't fit in. To him, this wasn't just a job, it was his stage, and the restaurant was his domain. He had a reputation for being overly selective about who he deemed worthy of good service. Then came Elizabeth Harris. The door swung open with a quiet chime, and in walked a tall, confident woman in a perfectly tailored black suit. She was about 45, with an air of authority that turned heads as she walked across the room. Jack's eyes narrowed as he watched her. No reservation. No, "Hi, I'm here for table 3. Just a calm stride toward the table by the window. His table. The one he reserved for special guests. Jack stepped forward, cutting her off like a human roadblock. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That table is taken." Elizabeth paused, her expression cool but curious. "Taken? Funny, I don't see a reserved sign." Jack's smile faltered. "We prefer guests with reservations," he said, drawing out the word prefer, like it was a personal rule he was generously sharing. Elizabeth tilted her head, letting the moment hang in the air. "Ah, I see. Well, I'd like a menu, please," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. Jack hesitated, then pulled out a menu like it weighed 100 pounds. He handed it over with the enthusiasm of someone serving jury duty. Without another word, he walked off, leaving Elizabeth at the table. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Jack didn't come back. The restaurant was far from busy. In fact, there were only a handful of other diners, all attended to promptly. But Jack? He busied himself polishing cutlery that didn't need polishing and arranging flowers that didn't need arranging. Every once in a while, he'd glance at Elizabeth, who sat there with the patience of someone used to handling people like him. Finally, Elizabeth raised her hand and waved down the manager. He was young, probably in his late 20s, and clearly nervous about being called over. "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Elizabeth gestured toward Jack. "I've been waiting for service. Is this your usual standard of hospitality?" The manager's eyes darted to Jack, who was pretending not to notice. Let me check on that for you," he stammered before hurrying to the back. In the kitchen, the manager pulled Jack aside. "What's going on? Why aren't you serving her?" he hissed under his breath. Jack shrugged, leaning casually against the counter. "She doesn't fit. You know the type we usually get here. We have a reputation to maintain." The manager's face turned a shade paler. "You can't just ignore a customer. She's not our customer," Jack interrupted with a smirk. "Trust me, this isn't a big deal." But it was a big deal. Elizabeth wasn't just sitting there quietly anymore. She had taken out her phone, typing something with a focused expression. And then she glanced up, locking eyes with the manager and Jack, her gaze icy enough to chill the room. The manager wiped his forehead. "Jack, seriously, just serve her," he muttered. But Jack didn't move. Instead, he leaned back and said, "Relax, she'll leave soon enough." Elizabeth, however, wasn't going anywhere. The next day, the Brass Fork was buzzing, not with elite diners, but with whispers among the staff. A reporter from a well-known local paper had strolled in, notebook in hand and a curious look on his face. Word had spread fast, too fast, about the incident from the day before. Apparently, someone on the team had spilled the beans to the press. Maybe it was the dishwasher, maybe the hostess. Either way, it was trouble. Jack Miller knew the second he saw the reporter that things were about to get messy. His jaw tightened as he watched the journalist chat with the manager near the bar. The guy wasn't just here for the brunch special. Jack felt it, a shift in the air like when a storm's rolling in, and yet he didn't budge, apologize. Not in his vocabulary. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. Still, he couldn't shake the unease. "What's the big deal?" he muttered under his breath while straightening his tie. "People get turned away all the time." But Jack's day was about to get a whole lot worse. Just as the reporter left, the door chimed, and in walked Elizabeth Harris, back for round 2. Only this time, she wasn't alone. A tall man in casual attire followed her, carrying a professional-looking camera. Jack's stomach sank. She wasn't here for lunch. She was here for payback. "Good afternoon," Elizabeth said, her voice calm but sharp as she scanned the room. Heads turned. Customers glanced up from their overpriced lattes. Even the staff froze. She wasn't yelling, but there was something about her tone that commanded attention. Jack's face darkened. He clenched his fists behind the counter. Great, he thought. Now it's a circus. Elizabeth strode toward the front desk with her companion in tow. "I'd like to speak with the manager," she said, her words clear and deliberate. The manager, already jittery from the reporter's visit, rushed over. His smile was so forced it looked painful. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can I assist you today?" Elizabeth didn't waste time. "Yesterday, I experienced some of the worst service I've ever encountered. I'd like to know if that reflects your corporate policy or just the personal bias of your staff." Her words sliced through the air like a knife. The manager's eyes darted to Jack, who was standing a few feet away, his face turning redder by the second. Before the manager could respond, Jack stepped in. "You're exaggerating, ma'am," Jack said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "We're simply committed to maintaining a certain standard of quality for our guests." Elizabeth's expression didn't waver. Instead, she took a step closer, her presence towering even without raising her voice. "And is that quality determined by the color of someone's skin?" she asked, her tone steady and cutting. "Is that what you call hospitality?" The restaurant fell silent. Even the soft jazz playing in the background seemed to fade. All eyes were now on Jack, who looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Before he could stammer a reply, the man with the camera hit record. The light on the device blinked on, and suddenly Jack was on the spot. "Ma'am, maybe this isn't the place for you," Jack blurted, his frustration bubbling over. "This is a restaurant for people who know their place." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Gasps rippled through the room. Customers exchanged shocked glances. The manager visibly paled, his hands trembling as he reached out, as if to physically grab the words and shove them back into Jack's mouth. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than any raised voice. "Interesting," she said softly. And then she turned to the camera. Jack's words hung in the air like a bad smell, impossible to ignore. The lively hum of the restaurant died instantly, replaced by a stunned silence. Forks and knives clattered as diners froze mid-bite, their eyes darting toward the scene unfolding in the center of the room. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She stood there, calm and composed, like a storm cloud just waiting to break. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was sharp and icy, every word cutting deep. "You've just proven," she said, her tone steady and deliberate, "that you're completely unfit to work in customer service." The room collectively held its breath. Jack opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. His confidence, so bulletproof moments ago, was suddenly nowhere to be found. Elizabeth didn't wait for him to recover. She turned smoothly toward the camera, her presence commanding. "My name is Senator Elizabeth Harris," she said, her voice resonating with authority. "I am an advocate for human rights and a leader in social justice reform. And this video," she gestured toward the camera, "is going straight to the press." If Jack had been red before, now he looked downright pale. The words hit him like a freight train. Around the room, diners whipped out their phones, eager to capture what was quickly becoming the event of the month. The manager, still frozen a few feet away, finally sprang into action, clutching his head as though trying to hold his job together with sheer willpower. "Ma'am, please," he stammered, stepping between Elizabeth and Jack. "There's no need for this to escalate." But it was too late. The tide had already turned. The man with the camera nodded to Elizabeth, then slowly panned to capture the stunned faces of the staff and customers. The hum of whispers began to rise as people muttered to each other, their shock turning into quiet outrage. Jack, finally finding his voice, stammered, "Wait, I didn't mean it like that. I was just..." But the excuses were weak and everyone knew it. His words drowned in the growing wave of murmurs and clicking phones. By the next morning, the internet was ablaze. The video had gone viral overnight, shared by influencers, news outlets, and advocacy groups alike. The hashtag #BrassForkScandal trended across platforms, and the restaurant's phone lines were jammed with complaints. The fallout was swift. Jack was fired on the spot. Effective immediately, didn't even cover it. The owner of the Brass Fork issued a public apology, but it wasn't enough to stem the outrage. Protests erupted outside the restaurant, with signs calling for justice and demanding accountability. In a televised interview 2 days later, Elizabeth sat calmly across from a well-known anchor. The footage from the restaurant played on the screen behind her as she spoke. "This isn't just about one employee," she said, her voice firm but passionate. "This is about a culture, one that normalizes discrimination and allows it to go unchecked. It's not enough to change laws. We have to change hearts and minds." The interview ended with thunderous applause from the live audience, and Elizabeth's message spread even further. Meanwhile, the Brass Fork's reputation never recovered. Boycotts continued, and within months, the once bustling hotspot had to close its doors for good. As for Jack, he disappeared into obscurity, a cautionary tale about the cost of arrogance and prejudice. Elizabeth's actions became a rallying cry for others facing similar discrimination, proving that even a quiet storm can make the loudest impact. The lesson was clear: words have power, and sometimes all it takes is one person standing their ground to change the tide. What would you have done in Jack's place? How would you have reacted if you were in Elizabeth's shoes? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments, leave a like if this story made you think, and let us know if you or someone you know has experienced something similar. This story was created to shed light on an important issue and to inspire positive change. Your voice matters, and together, we can make the world a better place.